Who became the last line of defense during the Battle of Berlin? Civilians with steel tubes on their shoulders. Handing anti-tank weapons to an unprepared militia exposed the final collapse of the state. The regime formed the Volkssturm. Commanders drafted every male from 16 to 60 years old. 6 million names on paper. This meant total demographic exhaustion. They had no soldiers left. The government threw people onto the streets who should never have seen combat. By April 1945, the capital turned into a fortress. Officers distributed the weapons directly from idling trucks. A quick shout about the firing mechanism, the cold, heavy metal tube pressed against the collarbone of a 16-year-old boy. He waited in the smoke. He aimed from his own doorstep. He fired at the approaching Allied armor. These point-blank street clashes dictated the rules of urban combat for the next 80 years. One cheap pipe leveled the odds against a 30-ton machine. The weapon became the last strategic argument of a ruined country. It gave a shattered nation a momentary, lethal bite. Untrained citizens destroyed hundreds of enemy tanks in the rubble. But the cost was immense. Most died on the pavement. How did this tool evolve? Why did it grow? What drove the change? From 30 meters of range to 100 in mere months. To arm these militias, the war industry mass-produced the Panzerfaust 60, millions of units by 1945. The escalation started small. Engineers built the Panzerfaust 30 Klein, 10 centimeters wide, 30 meters of reach. Pushing the range to 100 meters reflected the German infantry's inability to survive close combat against advancing tank wedges. Troops needed distance. HASAG plants shifted focus. The Panzerfaust 60 emerged. Engineers doubled the range. They increased powder charges. Production peaked rapidly. Trains delivered the Panzerfaust 100, a heavy 6-kilogram warhead. Precision died, raw mass compensated. The weapon shattered Allied tanks. The jet pierced 220 millimeters. One-third of the lost tanks in Normandy fell to a single weapon. A primitive tube with a range of 100 meters forced a hasty shift in strategy. Welding sparks showered the ground as mechanics fused metal meshes and heavy iron bed frames directly to the steel holes. Crews piled heavy sandbags, thick wooden logs, and spare track links onto their Shermans and Churchills. They needed a shield. Troops wanted to detonate the lethal-shaped charge far before it reached the main armor. Following the D-Day landings, the dense Normandy hedgerows turned into a perfect execution ground for advancing columns. Cheap mass-produced pipes paralyzed the advanced armored divisions of the victorious military forces. Commanders saw the flaw. Tanks could not fight alone. Generals strictly halted the independent movement of these steel giants through the narrow city streets. Officers made constant infantry escort a mandatory rule for every advancing tank. What happened to the weapon factories after the defeat? The assembly lines stopped, but the blueprint survived. Soviet engineering teams quickly seized the documents. The exact technical solutions that once shattered Allied armor now formed the foundation of a new superpower arsenal. The late-war Panzerfaust 150 represented a massive leap in lethality. The warhead looked different, smooth, pointed. It presented a sharp contrast to the crude, bulky shapes of early models. The diameter shrank to 10.5 centimeters, yet improved explosives punched straight through 300 millimeters of solid steel. The firing sequence became a precise execution. A soldier pulled the trigger. A two-stage propellant ignition launched the projectile. A clip-on fragmentation sleeve ruptured outward in a deadly arc. If the strike missed the hull, the weapon did not simply fall. A 3-second timer triggered an automatic self-destruct airburst over the trenches. Workers assembled 100,000 units in early 1945. But Red Army Vanguard units overran the HASAG manufacturing plant in Leipzig before frontline distribution could begin. Allied tank losses and welded cage armor were merely early symptoms of a permanent shift in urban combat. The final German design, the Panzerfaust 250, featured a pistol grip and a reloadable launch tube. It never left the drawing board. But these captured specifications dictated the rules of insurgent conflicts across the globe for decades. German High Command optimistically scheduled mass production for September 1945 to save the dying state. The actual implementation of the concept materialized 4 years later under a different flag. In 1949, the Soviet military officially adopted the RPG-2. What destroyed 70% of Soviet tanks during the final bloody months of the war? The statistics revealed a devastating truth. 70% of all armor losses came from handheld infantry weapons. Not heavy artillery batteries, but isolated soldiers wielding cheap stamped metal pipes. By the spring of 1945, this primitive iron tube completely erased the overwhelming strategic advantage of massive armored armadas. The first shipments of these shaped charge launchers reached the Eastern Front trenches in September 1943. They arrived exactly when Soviet tank brigades were spearheading relentless offensives across the devastated European landscape. The new weapon immediately proved its terrifying capacity to obliterate the legendary T-34 with a single shot. A catastrophic exchange rate rapidly emerged on the brutalized battlefield. Obliterating one armored vehicle instantly negated thousands of hours of intense labor from dedicated Soviet factory workers. A disposable tube costing a few minor Reichsmarks eradicated a complex machine that required vast material resources to cast, assemble, and deploy. Brutal urban combat began when the advancing front line shifted into the dense European cities. Specialized tank hunter teams waited silently inside ruined buildings and narrow residential alleys. The heavy scraping of steel tank tracks against broken brick echoed loudly through the confined urban canyons. A hunter waited patiently for the colossal machine to expose its vulnerable side armor before pulling the firing lever. A rapid tactical retreat immediately followed the explosive roar, while supporting riflemen laid down heavy covering fire. Mass tank production suddenly hit an insurmountable wall of decentralized infantrymen hiding in the shattered remains of Berlin. The final statistics of this relentless meat grinder settled on one definitive figure: 70%. A Soviet infantryman steps forward. He holds a bottle. Gasoline sloshes inside. Thousands of factories build tanks behind him, but he carries only glass. The supply paradox was stark. Allies dominated tank production. Infantry weapons became an afterthought. The Red Army lacked modern launchers. Troops improvised. Satchel charges, Molotov cocktails. Captured German rocket launchers fixed this. Those very tubes burned T-34s. They became a valuable trophy. Advancing infantry turned them around. Victorious armies utilized primitive methods. Designers tested RPG-1, but this domestic weapon arrived too late and completely missed the frontline combat. How do you destroy armor from inside a closed room without exposing your position? The British removed the explosive exhaust entirely. While Soviet infantry waited for delayed blueprints, London engineers delivered a stealthy urban combat solution. They created the PIAT. No smoke, no flash. The weapon launched a shaped charge with a massive internal spring. Stealth demanded a high price. The effective range dropped to barely 50 meters. Firing drove 14.5 kilograms of solid metal violently into the shooter's shoulder. In theory, this massive recoil recocked the mechanism automatically. In combat, the heavy tube jammed frequently. To reload a stuck weapon, a soldier stood up to full height directly under enemy fire. He grabbed the steel frame. He pulled the stiff spring backward with both hands. The sheer physical strain exposed the man completely. The quiet ambush tool turned into a heavy trap. The desperate infantryman cocked the jammed mechanism with his boots. A weapon forged to shatter German armor became a free blueprint for German retribution. The crushing spring of the British Piat was a direct response. It bypassed the fatal flaw of the American 1942 design. The manual promised lethal accuracy at 150 meters. Reality was different. A dead battery, no spark. The bazooka established the new technological standard. 2 men, 1 tube. They loaded a 60mm rocket from the rear. It punched through 75 to 100 millimeters of solid steel, enough to halt standard medium tanks. But the launch sequence relied entirely on electricity. Supplying active dry cell batteries across a frozen continent forced the military to build a highly vulnerable logistics chain. The enemy relied on crude mechanical percussion. America pushed fragile chemistry. Conveyor belts back home assembled flawless weapons. European winters dismantled their utility. Batteries drained instantly in sub-zero temperatures. The gunner pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. A highly advanced blueprint was completely paralyzed by simple frost. Discarded launchers littered the frozen mud. Captured tubes crossed the front line straight to German engineering desks. What happens when you copy a captured American design and scale the caliber to 88 millimeters? You get a tool that punches straight through any existing defense. Those captured 60mm tubes from the United States landed on German drafting tables and returned to the front lines as a drastically heavier response. 200mm of penetration guaranteed the complete destruction of any Allied medium tank. The incoming projectile easily defeated the 63mm of frontal armor on a standard Sherman. The crew had no chance. The response extended beyond shoulder-fired rockets and went straight into the dirt itself. Engineers developed the Teller mine. They packed a heavy steel dish with 5 kilograms of high explosives and buried millions of them under the soil to create dense defensive belts. Desperate infantrymen also attached magnetic charges directly onto the passing steel holes during close combat. Firing the Panzerschreck required a tightly coordinated two-man team in the trenches. The first number aimed the weapon from behind a square metal plate, while the second number loaded the heavy projectile into the open breech. A massive blast of fire erupted behind the weapon upon pulling the trigger. The intense heat of the exhaust gases reflected directly off the protective metal shield right in front of the shooter's face. This specific shield prevented the deadly backblast from incinerating the operator during the ambush. Trenches blocked armor access. In 1943, one infantryman with a cheap metal tube gained the power to incinerate heavy armor. How do you pierce 200 millimeters of armor by hand? With a shaped charge from 30 meters. 200 millimeters of steel armor. Upon impact, the warhead focused its blast into a high-velocity jet. It sliced through 140 to 200 millimeters of solid metal. 200 millimeters exceeds the frontal plate thickness of a Soviet IS-2 or a British Churchill tank. The balance of power shifted. A lone infantryman could now annihilate a 40-ton combat vehicle. No Allied tank could survive a direct strike. But this devastation required suicidal proximity. The operator had to wait. A sharp metallic click sounded as the soldier flipped up the folding sight. He estimated the gap. He watched the steel chassis close in. The weapon featured aiming notches strictly for 30, 60, and 80 meters. Hitting a moving target under heavy machine gun fire demanded extreme luck. In reality, the operator secured a decent chance only at 30 meters. 30 meters meant letting the enemy drive almost on top of the trench. To offset the terrifying range, engineers minimized the mass. The entire launcher weighed just 5 to 7 kilograms. A single soldier easily carried 2 loaded installations into battle at once. To launch a heavy warhead from a light pipe, designers sacrificed the shooter. 10 meters of lethal zone behind the tube. They kept the weapon simple, a single-shot recoilless launcher. Factories packed the steel cylinder with black powder. The explosive sat right on top. The infantryman tucked the tube under his arm. He flipped the sight. He pressed the trigger. The primer sparked. The powder detonated. The shot generated 0 recoil, but a massive pillar of fire erupted backward. 10 meters behind the shooter turned into a guaranteed kill zone due to the exhaust. Red warning labels on the hull flagged the extreme threat. Urban combat became suicidal. Soldiers fired from tight city alleys. The flame reflected off solid brick walls. Fire engulfed them. Blowback struck fast. It crushed lungs. Uniforms melted instantly. Pressure tore through small rooms, leaving the operator concussed and severely burned. Commanders officially banned firing from enclosed spaces. Why did the state launch manufacturing of such dangerous weapons so rapidly? The continuous stream of Allied armor demanded an immediate solution. A deadly tube packed with gunpowder became a direct response to the massive output of American Shermans. German factories needed a cheap assembly line weapon to counter this overwhelming steel tide. Engineers proposed a simple concept of a disposable recoilless launch pipe firing a shaped charge warhead. The initial proving ground trials revealed severe problems with backblast and poor armor penetration. The acrid smell of burnt black powder hung heavily over the test fields while technicians refined the design. Yet the high command could not afford long development cycles while thousands of Soviet tanks rolled toward the eastern borders. Industrial planners prioritized ease of use and massive manufacturing scale over operator safety or complex mechanics. By 1943, the factories finalized the blueprints and delivered the first operational batches to the front lines. The military designated this early model as the Panzerfaust 30. Infantrymen tested the new disposable launchers in actual combat against advancing enemy columns. The results were undeniable. State planners drastically expanded the production lines right after these initial field trials. At the start of the war, light guns pierced any armor. They became scrap. Before 1943 brought grenade launchers, infantry dove under steel tracks. They carried magnetic mines. The 37mm cannon failed first. Gunners named it the door knocker. A dull metallic thud echoed. The shell bounced. The Panzer III lost its edge. The Panzer IV struggled. Enemy armor grew thicker. Engineers rushed 50mm guns. Then 75mm cannons followed. Production lagged. Towed cannons weighed over 400 kilograms. They required a full crew and a heavy tractor. One man had to carry the new weapon. Old anti-tank rifles failed. Infantry stood defenseless. The old tactics died. Only magnetic anti-tank charges remained. A soldier sprinted forward. The engine roared. He pressed the explosive close. Tracks chewed mud. Death passed centimeters away. To destroy the machine, the infantryman physically attached his charge to the moving hull. German factories stamped out 8 million disposable grenade launchers. This staggering quantity provided enough firepower to arm entire cities of completely untrained people. Why did the army suddenly need 8 million simple tubes? Because old cannons and magnetic mines permanently lost their meaning on the Eastern Front in 1942. The initial invasion moved exactly according to plan. German forces rapidly decimated the older light BT series. The armor burned. Tactics worked. But the illusion of dominance shattered without warning. A severe technological shock permanently erased decades of military strategy. Frontline soldiers watched in disbelief as standard anti-tank shells bounced harmlessly off thick, sloped armor. Before the collapse, the regime drafted anyone still capable of standing. Militiamen aged 16 to 60 waited in ruined city blocks holding these single-use pipes. Yet this urban desperation traced back to one specific moment. The old rules of war vanished forever. Then the T-34 and KV-1 appeared.